The day the CEO fired the old mechanic, the whole factory went silent. Nobody dared to speak, but everyone felt it, the kind of silence that cuts deeper than words. The man who had spent more than 3 decades keeping those engines alive was told he was too slow for the company's new vision. His hands, once strong enough to bring dead machines back to life, now trembled as he packed his worn-out tools into a rusted metal box. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply nodded, as if he'd seen this coming from the moment the suits took over the garage. But that night, something began to stir beyond the city lights. In the deep hum of motorcycle engines echoing across the highway, a group of bikers, men and women the old mechanic had once helped without charging a dime, had heard what happened. They remembered the nights he'd stayed up until dawn fixing their broken rides, refusing payment because, in his words, brothers don't build brothers. They didn't care about titles or boardrooms. All they knew was loyalty, and someone had just disrespected one of their own. By morning, the CEO's glass office tower stood under a black cloud of exhaust smoke. Dozens of bikes lined the street like an army of thunder, chrome gleaming in the sun. The sound was deafening, a roar that made the walls shake and the suits peek from their windows in fear. The man who fired the mechanic was about to learn a lesson that no business school could ever teach. Respect isn't earned by power, but by the way you treat the people who build it for you. As the elevator doors opened and the old mechanic stepped out, called back by the noise outside, everyone watched. The same hands that once turned bolts now clutched his hat tightly against his chest. The CEO froze, and in that frozen moment, surrounded by the rumble of loyalty and justice, he finally understood that he hadn't fired a worker. He had dismissed a legacy. That morning, in front of every trembling executive and every revving engine, the old man didn't need revenge. He had something far greater, the unspoken honor of those who still believe that integrity can't be measured by speed and that some engines only run because of the heart that fuels them. The question wasn't whether the bikers came for payback. It was whether the CEO could ever face the sound of an engine again without hearing the ghost of the man he'd tried to erase. The CEO stood at his window, staring down at the line of motorcycles that filled the company's parking lot. Their engines had gone silent now, but the echo of their arrival still vibrated in his chest like an aftershock. He had built this company from ambition and discipline, or so he told himself. Yet, at that moment, as leather-clad riders removed their helmets and stared up at him with unflinching eyes, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: fear. Not the kind born from danger, but the kind that comes from realizing you may have done something unforgivable. Down below, the old mechanic stood beside the bikes. His gray hair fluttered in the wind, his hands greasy as always, his eyes calm but unreadable. He hadn't called them. He didn't need to. Word travels fast among those who live by loyalty, and these men and women owed him more than they could ever repay. One by one, they revved their engines in salute, not of rebellion, but of respect. The sound rolled like thunder through the city streets, shaking glass and hearts alike. Inside, the CEO's assistant whispered nervously, "Should we call security?" But he knew it wouldn't matter. These people weren't there to fight. They were there to make him face the weight of his own decisions. For years, he'd valued efficiency over effort, profit over people. He'd seen men like the old mechanic as replaceable, mere cogs in a machine. But today, the machine had stopped. The very soul he had dismissed had become the reason everything else now felt hollow. The old mechanic didn't shout or demand anything. He simply stood there, looking up at the office tower, the faint reflection of his own weary face mirrored in the CEO's pristine glass. It was a perfect metaphor. A man who had spent his life working with metal and fire, now staring at the cold, polished surface of the world that had forgotten him. The bikers remained silent, their presence alone speaking volumes. The kind of respect that can't be bought, only earned through years of quiet goodness. Upstairs, the CEO turned away from the window. His reflection looked older than it had yesterday. Something inside him, something long buried under greed and deadlines, began to stir. He thought of his own father, a mechanic who had taught him how to work with his hands before he chose suits over inches. For the first time in years, he wondered whether the man he had become would make his father proud. And deep down, he already knew the answer. The day stretched on in uneasy silence. Employees whispered in the corridors, glancing toward the glass walls of the executive floor, where tension hung heavy in the air. The CEO canceled every meeting, every call. He couldn't focus. The sight of those bikers, men who owed nothing to the company but everything to the mechanic he'd fired, lingered in his mind like a haunting. It wasn't rebellion that disturbed him. It was loyalty. Loyalty that no paycheck could command. Meanwhile, outside, the old mechanic sat on the curb beside one of the motorcycles, sipping coffee from a paper cup someone had handed him. His fingers traced the faded scar on the tank, a mark he remembered fixing years ago. Each scratch on those bikes told a story he was part of. Midnight repairs, roadside rescues, moments when a stranger's kindness turned into lifelong friendship. He never sought recognition. He found meaning in the hum of an engine and the trust in another's eyes. When the CEO finally stepped outside, the sound of the door alone drew every head toward him. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement, a jarring contrast to the worn boots and oil-stained jeans before him. The bikers didn't move. They just watched, waiting to see what kind of man stood behind the title. The old mechanic rose slowly, brushing dust from his hands, and for a heartbeat, the years between them seemed to vanish. Just two men, one who built with his hands and one who built with his pride. "I didn't ask them to come," the old man said quietly. His voice was steady, without anger. "They came because I once fixed their bikes when no one else would. I guess some debts aren't paid in money." The CEO swallowed hard, searching for words that wouldn't sound hollow. But how do you apologize for decades of indifference? How do you admit that you've forgotten what work, respect, and humanity really mean? His silence said more than words ever could. One of the bikers stepped forward, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek and eyes full of quiet fire. "He taught us to take care of our engines. But more than that, he taught us to take care of each other," he said. "You fired him for being slow? Maybe you just don't understand that some things aren't meant to be rushed." The crowd murmured in agreement, and the CEO felt the weight of every gaze pressing down on him. For the first time, he wasn't the most powerful man there, just the most lost. The CEO stood still, every instinct screaming at him to retreat, but something inside refused to move. The words of the biker echoed in his mind. Some things aren't meant to be rushed. He realized how foreign that concept had become to him. For years, every second had been measured in productivity, every person reduced to output. But in that moment, surrounded by those who valued heart over haste, he began to see the flaw in the empire he'd built. It wasn't built on excellence. It was built on fear, and fear never lasts. The old mechanic turned to the group, nodding faintly, signaling them to calm down. "We're not here for trouble," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Let's not forget who we are." The bikers respected him like soldiers obeying a general. Slowly, they lowered their arms, stepped back, and created a circle around the two men. The street grew quiet again, the city noise fading beneath the gravity of that silence. It was no longer about anger. It was about truth. "I worked here for 34 years, the old man began. "Watched this place grow from a single shop to this tower of glass. I gave it my back, my hands, and most of my youth. And when my speed faded, they told me I wasn't good enough anymore." He looked down, his voice breaking slightly. "But these people," he gestured to the bikers, "they never asked how fast I worked, only if I cared." His words struck deep, cutting through the CEO's pride like rust through steel. The CEO finally spoke. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he said weakly, his voice almost pleading. "The board, the investors," but the old man shook his head. "Pressure doesn't give you the right to forget decency," he interrupted softly. "A company without respect isn't a company at all. It's a machine without a soul." The simplicity of the statement carried more power than any corporate lecture ever could. Even the wind seemed to pause as those words hung in the air. The CEO looked around, at the faces of his employees watching from the windows, at the bikers standing united in quiet defiance, at the old man whose humility had somehow commanded an army. For the first time in his life, he felt small. Not because he was weak, but because he realized he'd been standing on the shoulders of giants and never once looked down to thank them. The tension began to dissolve, replaced by something heavier: reflection. The The CEO's eyes drifted toward the garage at the side of the building, dusty and nearly forgotten. Years ago, that had been the heart of the company, where grease and laughter mixed freely. Now it was a storage room, filled with boxes instead of stories. Something inside him ached at the memory of the smell of oil, the clang of metal, the sound of men working with purpose. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was guilt. "Come with me," he said suddenly. The old mechanic hesitated, confused, but followed as the CEO led him back into the building. The crowd stayed outside, their engines silent but ready, watching with cautious eyes. Inside, the sterile hallway smelled of coffee and money, not sweat or work. The CEO stopped in front of the old garage door and, without a word, rolled it open. Dust swirled in the sunlight. The smell of rust and oil rushed out like a ghost from the past. "This is where you started," the CEO said quietly, "and where I learned everything I needed to forget." He stepped inside, brushing his hand across an abandoned workbench. "My father used to say that engines have souls, that if you treat them right, they'll take care of you. I used to laugh at that." He turned to the old man, his eyes heavy with regret. "Now I think I understand. It wasn't about the engines. It was about people." The old mechanic's eyes softened. "Your father was a good man," he said gently. "He taught me how to fix things. Not just machines, but people too, when you take the time to listen." He paused, looking around the garage that had once been his second home. "You don't need to fix me, son. You need to fix this place. Start by remembering what it was built for." His words landed like a final diagnosis, not of machinery, but of a broken heart. For the first time in years, the CEO smiled. Not a corporate smile, but a real one. "Maybe," he said quietly, "it's time to rebuild." The old mechanic nodded, his weathered face illuminated by the morning light spilling through the cracked windows. Outside, the bikers revved their engines again, not in anger this time, but in approval. The sound rolled through the air like a promise that sometimes redemption begins with the courage to admit you've forgotten what truly matters. The next morning, the company felt different. Word had spread fast, not through memos or press releases, but through whispers that carried something stronger than gossip: respect. The employees who had once walked past the old mechanic without a glance now greeted him with quiet smiles. Even the younger ones, who had only known him as the slow old guy from the workshop, began to realize the weight of his legacy. He had become a living reminder that greatness isn't loud, it's consistent. The CEO arrived earlier than he had in years. Instead of heading straight to his office, he went to the garage. The smell of oil and steel hit him like memory and penance combined. The old mechanic was already there, sleeves rolled up, tightening a bolt on an ancient company truck that hadn't moved in years. "Didn't think I'd see you down here," the old man said without looking up. The CEO chuckled softly. "Neither did I, but I figure it's about time I got my hands dirty again." That single moment, two men side by side, one rediscovering what it meant to build, carried more meaning than any meeting or merger. The CEO struggled to remember the last time he'd used a wrench. His fingers fumbled, awkward at first, but the old mechanic's quiet patience guided him. It was like learning to breathe again. With every turn of the tool, something inside him loosened. The tension, the pride, the emptiness that years of ambition had left behind. Outside the garage, employees gathered near the windows, watching in disbelief. Their CEO, the man who once scolded them for a minute lost, was now covered in grease, laughing with the man he'd once called obsolete. It was more than a sight. It was a statement. For the first time, people felt like the company had a heart again, that maybe they weren't just part of a business. Maybe they were part of a story. By noon, the old truck roared to life. The sound was rough but strong, echoing through the entire building. People cheered spontaneously, clapping and laughing, as if something sacred had been revived. The CEO wiped his hands on a rag, his eyes shining with pride. "She still runs," he said. The old mechanic smiled, nodding slowly. "Told you, boss. Some engines just need someone to believe in them again." Days turned into weeks, and the energy within the company began to transform. Meetings no longer started with spreadsheets and ended with silence. Now, people talked about ideas, about improvements, about each other. The CEO had stopped hiding behind numbers. He started walking the floors, shaking hands, asking questions, listening. It wasn't a show. It was redemption in motion. And every step he took brought him closer to the kind of leader his father would have wanted him to be. The old mechanic, though still slower than the rest, became something more than an employee. He became the heart of the place. When machines broke down, people came to him not just for repairs but for advice. He had a way of explaining things that turned metal into metaphor. Engines are like people, he'd say. You can push them hard, but if you never give them time to cool, they'll burn out. Every machine has a rhythm. Find it, and you'll keep it alive. Even the bikers, who had long since returned to their roads, began visiting on weekends. They brought coffee, stories, and laughter. The once cold parking lot had turned into a gathering place, where chrome met concrete and brotherhood replaced hierarchy. To outsiders, it looked like rebellion. To those who knew, it was a reunion, a reminder that community doesn't need permission to exist. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, the CEO stood outside watching the old mechanic teaching a young intern how to weld. Sparks danced in the golden light, and he felt something stir inside him again. Pride, but not the hollow kind. This was real. This was what had been missing all along. He realized that leadership wasn't about standing above people. It was about standing with them, even when your hands get dirty. That night, long after everyone had gone home, the CEO sat alone in his office, the hum of the old truck still echoing faintly from below. He opened a drawer and pulled out a faded photograph. His father, smiling in front of a small garage, a young boy beside him. He smiled faintly, whispering into the quiet room, "You were right, Dad. Engines do have souls, and so do people." For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He felt grounded, the way the old mechanic always had. The following Monday, the CEO gathered every employee in the factory courtyard. It wasn't a corporate announcement or a motivational speech. It was something much deeper. Standing on a crate with his sleeves rolled up and oil still under his fingernails, he looked nothing like the man who had fired a mechanic for being too slow. He looked like someone who had finally remembered what it meant to lead. For years, he began, his voice steady but full of remorse. I built this company thinking success meant speed. I was wrong. Success isn't how fast we move. It's how much we care while moving. The crowd was silent. Even the machines inside seemed to pause. He continued, glancing toward the old mechanic standing off to the side, arms crossed, his eyes full of quiet pride. This man, the CEO said, gave more to this place than any of us realized. When I let him go, I didn't just lose a worker. I lost our foundation. The day he left, this company lost its soul. A murmur rippled through the employees, not of judgment, but of shared realization. Everyone felt it. Everyone knew he was right. The old mechanic shook his head modestly. You didn't lose it, he said softly, his voice carrying even over the hum of the distant city. You just forgot where it was. The CEO smiled faintly, his eyes wet but unashamed. Then it's time we remember, all of us. He looked out over the faces before him, seeing not workers or staff, but people, tired, flawed, hopeful people who had kept his dream alive even when he'd forgotten how to dream himself. When he finished speaking, no one clapped. They didn't need to. The silence that followed was heavier than applause, the kind that carries respect, forgiveness, and the promise of change. For the first time, the company wasn't just a business anymore. It was a family rediscovering its heartbeat. The kind of moment that doesn't make headlines but changes lives quietly, deeply, and forever. Afterward, as people returned to their work with a sense of renewed purpose, the CEO and the old mechanic stood together for a long while, watching. You think they'll believe in me again? The CEO asked. The old man smiled gently. You don't earn belief with speeches, he said. You earn it by showing up, every day, even when no one's watching. That's what you taught them today, without even knowing it. Weeks turned into months, and the change became impossible to ignore. The factory no longer ran on fear or deadlines. It ran on pride. Workers stayed late, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to finish what they started. The walls that once echoed with pressure now carried laughter, music, and the clatter of tools working in harmony. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. And for the first time in a long while, The CEO didn't dread coming to work. He looked forward to it. The old mechanic, though his steps had grown slower, carried himself with a new lightness. He wasn't just fixing machines anymore. He was fixing people. Young workers began to gather around him, like students around a mentor. He told stories, shared lessons, and reminded them that every sound a motor made had something to teach, if they listened closely enough. They called him Pops, a nickname that filled the air with warmth every time it was said. One afternoon, the CEO found him sitting outside by the garage, staring at the sunset. "Pops," he said with a grin, "you've got everyone working harder than ever." The old man chuckled. "Not harder," he replied, "just better. When people feel seen, they don't drag their feet. They lift their heads." The CEO nodded, letting the words sink in. It was the same lesson he'd been learning, piece by piece, every day since the bikers had shown up. But change always comes with challenges. One morning, the old mechanic collapsed in the workshop, a wrench falling from his trembling hand. Panic spread fast. The CEO rushed down from his office, pushing through the crowd as paramedics arrived. He knelt beside him, gripping his hand. "Stay with me," he whispered, voice breaking. The old man opened his eyes faintly, managing a weak smile. "Guess I finally got too slow, huh?" The CEO shook his head, tears falling freely. "No," he said, "you're the heartbeat of this place. You can't stop now." As they lifted him onto the stretcher, the employees, the same people who once passed him without notice, lined the hallway in silence, heads bowed. The CEO followed closely behind, his chest heavy with fear. Outside, as the ambulance doors closed, a single motorcycle engine roared in the distance. Then another. Then dozens. The bikers had returned, not for protest this time, but for prayer. It was loyalty, louder than sirens. A bond that no title, no salary, no company could ever buy. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and worry. The CEO sat outside the emergency room, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly, as if praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. Every tick of the clock felt like a judgment. Behind those doors, the man who had taught him more about life in the past few months than any businessman or ever could was fighting to stay alive. He had never felt so powerless, and for a man who'd spent his life in control, that helplessness was unbearable. As the hours passed, more people arrived. Mechanics, secretaries, truck drivers, bikers, even executives in tailored suits, all gathered in the waiting room. No one said much. They didn't need to. Each person there had a story about the old man. How he stayed after hours to fix a broken vehicle so a worker could get home to his family. How he gave rides in the rain, lent money he didn't have, listened when no one else would. He had built a life made not of wealth, but of kindness. And now, that kindness had filled an entire room. When the doctor finally stepped out, the silence tightened. "He's stable," she said softly, "but his heart's weak. He needs rest, real rest." A wave of relief and sadness washed through the crowd. The CEO closed his eyes, exhaling for what felt like the first time in hours. "Can I see him?" he asked. The doctor nodded, and moments later, he stood beside the bed of the man who had changed him forever. The old mechanic looked frail, his skin pale against the white sheets, but his eyes, those steady, kind eyes, still held their spark. "Guess you're not rid of me yet," he murmured. The CEO smiled through tears. "You scare the life out of all of us," he said. The old man chuckled weakly. "About time I got your heart working again." They both laughed softly, the sound fragile but full of meaning. The CEO sat down, taking the old man's hand. "You were right about everything," he said quietly. "I built a company, but you built a family. I was blind to what mattered until you showed up again." The old man smiled faintly. "Then promise me something," he said. "Don't forget it this time. When I'm gone, keep the fire burning. Not for profit, but for people." The CEO nodded, his voice trembling. "I promise, Pops. I swear it." When the old mechanic finally returned to the factory weeks later, he was weaker, but his spirit hadn't dimmed. The moment he stepped through the doors, the place erupted in applause. Workers stopped their machines, the bikers revved their engines outside, and the CEO met him at the entrance, embracing him like a son welcoming home his father. "Good to have you back," the CEO whispered. The old man smiled. "Didn't think you'd start the engines without me." From that day on, the company wasn't just a company anymore. It was a legacy of loyalty, gratitude, and human connection. The CEO transformed the old garage into a memorial workspace called the Heart of the Machine, where apprentices could learn, rest, and remember the man who had taught them that steel and compassion could coexist. A small plaque above the door read, "Built by hands, powered by heart." No one could walk past it without feeling something shift inside. The old mechanic worked part-time, mostly sitting in his corner chair, guiding young workers, telling stories that always ended with a quiet lesson. He never asked for recognition, never demanded anything. And that's what made people love him even more. The CEO often joined him there in the afternoons, and they'd watch the workers together, one man leading with wisdom, the other with gratitude. Two different kinds of strength, finally united. One evening, as the sun poured golden light through the garage windows, the old man looked around, smiling faintly. "You did it," he said. "You gave this place its soul back." The CEO shook his head. "No, Pops," he said softly. "You did." The old man chuckled. "Maybe. But it took you to believe in it again." For a moment, they just sat in silence, the hum of machinery echoing like a heartbeat, steady, alive, eternal. And though the years would pass and engines would change, the story of the old mechanic lived on. Every new worker who joined the company heard it. About the day a CEO fired a man for being too slow, and how the world stopped just long enough to remind him that true speed means nothing without direction, and true success means nothing without a soul. And somewhere, on quiet mornings, when the first engine started, people swore they could still hear the soft laughter of a man who taught them all how to keep the fire burning. As the years passed, the story of the old mechanic and the CEO became more than company lore. It became a legend whispered between generations. Every newcomer learned it not as a tale of business, but as a parable about respect, humility, and redemption. The image of the bikers lined up outside the glass tower became a symbol, a reminder that when power forgets compassion, loyalty will rise to restore balance. And somewhere in the hum of every engine, in the rhythm of every tool, lived the heartbeat of the man who once fixed more than machines. He fixed people. The CEO often found himself walking through the workshop in quiet reflection. The echo of laughter, the smell of oil, the sight of hands working in harmony, all of it reminded him of how far they had come. He knew success wasn't measured in charts or reports anymore, but in the faces of those who believed again. It wasn't speed that made a company great. It was the strength of the people behind it, moving with purpose and heart. The slowest hands, he had learned, were often the ones that built the strongest foundations. One morning, he stood before the memorial wall in the heart of the machine. A small bronze plate caught the sunlight, engraved with words that had changed his life forever. A machine without a soul is just metal. A company without heart is just noise. He smiled faintly, whispering, "You were right, Pops." For a moment, he closed his eyes and swore he could hear the sound of an old wrench turning, steady and sure. The legacy lived not in memory, but in motion, in every act of kindness, in every spark that refused to fade. And maybe that's the truth we all forget too easily. That greatness isn't about being the fastest or the richest, but about being the kind of person others stand up for when life tries to knock you down. The old mechanic story is a mirror for us all, a reminder that no matter how high we climb, we're only as strong as the hands that lifted us there. Because when respect fuels your actions and gratitude guides your path, even the slowest journey becomes timeless. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone who taught you the value of honesty, hard work, or heart, share it. Leave a comment below about that person who changed your path. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, subscribe and stay with us. Because somewhere out there, another forgotten hero is waiting to be remembered, and their story deserves to be told.